To deal with the issue of slavery, there was a compromise proposed by James Madison of Virginia. This compromise counted each slave as 3/5 of a person in determining a state's population for representation in the House of Representatives. Remember when we were debating, the question was counting slaves as whole people, not counting them at all, or counting them for taxes or not counting them for taxes. So James Madison's proposal was saying 3/5 of a person would define a slave. And this was known as the 3/5 compromise. Here's an image that kind of shows what that means. And this is, like the title of this, humanness, kind of in quotes here, because how human is it to count a person as 3/5 of a person? But the northern delegates argued that slaves were technically considered property, therefore they didn't want to count them as a full person because then the southern states would have had more power in Congress. And obviously the northern states did not think that was fair since the slaves were not citizens and they could not vote. Slavery population was not the only issue when it came to the issue of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. There was another dispute that surrounded heavily upon the issue of trade, specifically the slave trade. Northern delegates, they thought that Congress needed to control trade between states and other countries, while Southerners were worried that Congress would tax Southern crops and would use this power to outlaw the slave trade. Therefore, the Southern delegates are going to be against Congress controlling trade between states and countries because they think that Congress is going to be against them when it comes to their crops and the slave trade. Many states in the North had already outlawed slave trade in their boundaries. That's why the Southern states were so nervous about this, and they didn't want to get essentially picked on because Northerners in some Northern states were already heavily against the trading of slaves in state boundaries. In all seriousness, the majority of delegates, they wanted to end the slave trade completely, which means they didn't want any more slaves coming in from outside the United States, from Africa. We learned a little bit about the slave trade earlier this year. They wanted to completely stop that. But Southerners, once again, they're going to claim that their economies would essentially collapse without a constant supply of new slaves because largely agricultural based, and those large plantations, they claimed that they couldn't sustain themselves if they had to actually pay people to work them. And so the issue of slavery is going to continue on. To deal with the issue of slave trade, there was another compromise made by the Constitutional Convention. In this compromise, they said that Congress is going to have the power to control trade, but it's going to have two limitations on it. The first limitation is that Congress could only place a tax on exports to other countries, which means that things going out of the United States, they could not place a tax on those. So that would mean Southern crops. Like if the South wanted to export tobacco to Spain, the United States Congress could not place a tax on those goods. The other limitation was that Congress could not interfere with the slave trade for 20 years. And this was until about 1808. So that's 20 years past where they're meeting right now. So this dealt with the issue of the Southerners being scared that Congress is essentially going to cut off the slave trade that helps their economies. And so essentially they're just going to delay this decision for another 20 years. To really make sure that the Southern states are with them, and to satisfy the Southern states are going to fight for something called the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the states are going to agree to this Fugitive Slave Clause. What this is this was a law that said that escaped slaves had to be returned to their owners, even if they were caught in a free state. So say a slave from Virginia escaped to Pennsylvania. People in Pennsylvania were held accountable to pretty much take this slave in and return it to their owner. It was their responsibility, and that was the law. this slave trade, or the fugitive slave cause, is really going to create a lot of issues with Northerners. They're not going to be happy about this. And later down the road, Northerners are essentially going to ignore this clause, and it's going to create a lot of tension between the northern and southern states. But that's not going to be for another 20 or 30 years or so. So these compromises, they're going to help unite the states. Remember, their main goal right now is to get this Constitution ratified and passed. But essentially, they're just delaying the inevitable with slavery. They know it's a hot issue topic. There's a lot of different opinions on it. And they're delaying the inevitable with the whole issue surrounding slavery, as we will see.